March 1945, Bonn, Germany. Allied bombs have cracked the university walls open. A Polish lab technician clears debris from a second-floor restroom. She pulls wet scraps of paper from a clogged toilet. Typed pages, official formatting, names, hundreds of names, ranks, specialties, institutions. The ink has bled, but the entries are legible. Someone tried to destroy this document. They failed. The water preserved what secrecy could not destroy. Within 2 years, those names belonged to American employees. You're watching Curious Minds. Let's begin. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, a secret American program that recruited Nazi scientists, buried their war records, and rewrote their pasts. We will follow one list of names from a flooded toilet to Cape Canaveral, and we will ask the question the US government spent 40 years dodging. Who deserves credit for the moon, and who deserves a trial? The list had a name before it had a legend. Werner Osenberg, a mechanical engineer, ran the Nazi regime's research planning office. His job sounded simple: find every scientist in Germany worth keeping alive, track their work, make sure none of them ended up holding a rifle on the Eastern Front. The regime was bleeding talent. Brilliant minds were dying in trenches instead of laboratories. Osenberg's task was to reverse that waste. The job was enormous. By 1943, Germany was losing the war and losing its minds. Literally. Thousands of trained physicists, chemists, and engineers had been drafted and marched into combat. Osenberg convinced the regime to pull them off the front lines. He built a master registry. Every name, every specialty, every location. The list grew to roughly 15,000 entries. No government in history had built anything like it. Think of it as a catalog of Nazi Germany's entire intellectual arsenal. When the Allies closed in on Bonn, someone tore the pages apart and flushed them. But toilets in bombed-out buildings do not flush well. A Polish laboratory technician found the soggy fragments. Her name never made the record. No one thought to write it down at the time. She turned them over to Allied intelligence. British agents pieced the wet pages together carefully on a tabletop. They recognized what they held immediately: a complete inventory of the enemy's best minds. This went beyond a directory. It functioned like a shopping list. Every scientist the Nazis valued, organized, indexed, and locatable. The Allies no longer needed to search Germany lab by lab. They had the map. For the first time in modern warfare, science had a price list. 3 empires recognized its value instantly. The Americans wanted it. The British wanted it. The Soviets, advancing from the east at terrifying speed, wanted it most. The race had a name before it had rules. In July 1945, the US military launched Operation Overcast. The mission: locate, interrogate, and recruit German scientists before Moscow reached them. Speed mattered more than scrutiny. Intelligence officers fanned out across the collapsing Reich. Every name was a target. Every laboratory was a potential prize. They carried copies of the Osenberg list in their pockets. They knocked on doors, raided laboratories, searched basements, and made offers that sounded like orders. The first wave brought roughly 350 scientists: rocket engineers, aviation specialists, chemical weapons experts, submarine designers, radar specialists. They arrived at US military bases still wearing clothes from the rubble. Some carried nothing but the formulas in their heads. Most had held Nazi Party membership. Some had joined the SS. None of that appeared in the paperwork. Not yet. The editing would come later. President Truman signed a directive that summer. It seemed clear. No active Nazi or militarism supporter could enter the United States. The language left no ambiguity. The intent left no loopholes. The military read the order, noted it, then spent the next decade building detours around it. The directive sat in a filing cabinet. Officers did the opposite, methodically. The man they wanted most had been both, a party member and an SS officer. His name was Wernher von Braun. He designed the deadliest missile of World War II. He stood 20 years away from putting Americans on the moon. He was brilliant, ambitious, and complicit. His wartime record contained enough to end his career in any other era. It nearly did, and his file was about to be rewritten by the very government meant to judge him. Most war criminals looked the part. Von Braun did not. Tall, handsome, and magnetic, the kind of man who owned every room he entered. He spoke fluent English with charm. He smiled easily. He laughed often. He described the stars the way poets describe love. Journalists trusted him. Politicians liked him. Military officers competed to be his sponsor. That gift, making people forget what he had done, became his greatest weapon. Space obsessed him from childhood. By 12, he strapped fireworks to a wagon on a Berlin street. As a teenager, he joined the German Society for Space Travel. At 20, the German army took notice. They recruited him. They needed someone to build a long-range ballistic missile. Von Braun did not hesitate. The military had funding. Funding meant rockets. Rockets meant progress. Morality, politics, ideology, everything else was a detail. A detail he could overlook without losing sleep. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937. He joined the SS in 1940. Later, he called both memberships compulsory, a cost of doing business under Hitler. Historians still debate that claim. Membership records tell a different story. He rose to the rank of Sturmbannführer, the SS equivalent of major. That rank does not come from filling out a form. It requires commitment and service. What nobody debates is this. By 1942, von Braun directed the most ambitious weapons program in the Reich. The facility? Peenemünde. The weapon? The V2. The V2 became the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It flew faster than the speed of sound. It carried a 1-ton warhead. Its targets never heard it coming. The missile arrived before its own sound. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched over 3,000 V2 rockets. Most struck London, Antwerp, and Liège indiscriminately. They killed an estimated 9,000 civilians. Most victims never knew what hit them. Here is the number that rarely makes the headline. More people died building the V2 than the V2 killed in combat. Read that again. The weapon was less lethal than its own assembly line. After the Royal Air Force bombed Peenemünde in 1943, production moved underground. Engineers carved tunnels deep beneath the Harz Mountains. The work never stopped, day or night. The facility, Mittelwerk. The labor force, prisoners from a concentration camp next door called Mittelbau-Dora. Prisoners worked in freezing, airless tunnels for 18 hours a day. They slept underground on bare rock. They ate almost nothing. Disease spread without treatment. Dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis. Guards beat, whipped, or hanged those who collapsed in front of the others as a warning. Estimates place the death toll at 20,000 or more. 20,000 lives to build 3,000 rockets. That ratio defines the moral arithmetic of the entire program. Here is what most versions of this story leave out. Von Braun visited the tunnels. He toured the production line. He walked past the prisoners. He saw them. Records confirm at least one visit, possibly more. He later claimed he felt so horrified that he tried to improve conditions. No document supports that claim. Not in German archives, not in American files, not in his personal letters. Silence is not the same as innocence. By early 1945, von Braun could see the end. He gathered his senior engineers and hid critical V2 documents in an abandoned mine. Then he gathered his team and headed south toward the American lines. He surrendered to US soldiers near Reuth, Austria on May 2, 1945. He came with a smile, a firm handshake, and a carefully rehearsed pitch. He told them he wanted to build rockets for America. He did not mention the tunnels. He did not mention the dead. The Americans said yes. They agreed before checking his record. They agreed before reading the file on Mittelbau-Dora. They agreed because they needed what he knew, and because someone else wanted him just as badly. The Soviets were days behind. Every hour of delay was a strategic risk. His next stop? A military base in Texas. The paper trail behind him had already begun to change. Fort Bliss, Texas, summer 1945. Von Braun and roughly 120 German scientists arrived under military escort. They held no prisoner status. They held no freedom either. They held no clarity about what came next. They existed in a legal gray zone, wards of the army. They rebuilt V2 rockets from captured parts. They waited for someone to decide their future. Truman's directive stood in the way. No active Nazi could receive a US visa. When the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency reviewed the scientist's files, the results hit hard. Von Braun's dossier flagged him as a potential security threat. Arthur Rudolph's file documented forced labor oversight. Other files flagged SS membership, party ties, and direct knowledge of camp operations. Under those rules, most of them should have gone back to Germany. The rules were clear. The ambition was larger. The ambition won. The JIOA did not send them back. It rewrote the files instead. Officers stripped out references to Nazi Party membership. They deleted SS ranks. They softened the language. Ardent Nazi became not a Nazi in the usual sense. They did not hide the paper trail. They replaced it entirely. New folders, new evaluations, new histories, new men on paper. Clean records stapled to dirty hands. Think of it like a hospital scrubbing a surgeon's malpractice record, then handing him a scalpel. The files looked legitimate. The stamps looked real. The signatures checked out. Only the truth had changed. This process earned a name, Operation Paperclip, allegedly named for the paperclips that attached fresh cover sheets to the falsified dossiers. No single architect designed the program. No single order created it. It grew sideways, through memos, handshakes, and quiet agreements between officers who believed the Soviet threat justified any shortcut. The State Department pushed back. So did some officers inside the JIOA itself. Internal memos show real disagreement. One official warned that admitting known Nazis mocked Nuremberg. Those trials were happening at exactly the same time. The objection landed on a desk somewhere in Washington. Someone noted it. Someone else overruled it. The bureaucracy absorbed the objection and moved on. The program continued. The scientists stayed. The files stayed clean. By 1955, more than 1,600 German and Austrian scientists had entered the United States. They came through Paperclip and its successors. That is more than the entire faculty of most American universities at the time. Aerospace engineers, physicists, chemists, medical researchers who had experimented on camp prisoners. They received security clearances, government salaries, housing, and American citizenship. Some received awards. Some received patents. Some received tenure at universities. Von Braun received a national stage. He moved to Huntsville, Alabama in 1950. He took over the Army's rocket development program. Within 5 years, he became genuinely famous. Not as a former Nazi, but as America's rocket genius. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Twice. He consulted for Walt Disney on space programming. He co-produced television specials about space that reached tens of millions of viewers. His accent charmed audiences. His confidence reassured them. Children watched a former SS officer explain how humans would reach the moon. Not a single broadcast mentioned where his expertise began. The public knew nothing about the SS, nothing about Mittelbau-Dora, nothing about the rewritten dossiers. They knew a charming German man who loved rockets and spoke beautifully about the future. The silence was not accidental. It was engineered as carefully as the rockets themselves. Perhaps more carefully. America built its space mythology on that silence, and it held for 40 years. October 1957. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. America panicked. Congress panicked. The public panicked. A metal sphere the size of a beach ball orbited overhead, beeping, and it belonged to Moscow. Suddenly, the former Nazis in Huntsville stopped being an awkward secret. They became the solution. Von Braun's team had built rockets for the Army for 12 years. Now the entire country needed them to build faster, much faster. Within 4 months, Von Braun's team launched Explorer 1, the first American satellite. It rode a Jupiter C rocket, a direct descendant of the V2. The lineage was unmistakable to anyone who knew the history. The same engineering that rained terror on London now carried instruments into orbit. Nobody at the press conference mentioned Peenemünde. Nobody mentioned Dora. Nobody mentioned the dead. Reporters asked about the future. Von Braun obliged. The rewrite held perfectly. In 1960, Von Braun became NASA's first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. He oversaw the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built. His team delivered on time and on specification. The Saturn V never failed a crewed mission. It remains one of the greatest engineering achievements in history. Its chief architect once reported to Heinrich Himmler. That detail appeared in no press release, no profile, no interview. July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong steps onto the lunar surface. 600 million people watch. It is the largest television audience in history. Broadcasters frame the moment as a triumph of American ingenuity, democracy, and freedom. Nobody on air mentions the slave laborers who built the rocket's ancestor in tunnels. The gap between what the public celebrated and what the government concealed had never been wider. Von Braun did not work alone. Arthur Rudolph managed the Saturn V production pipeline at Marshall. His engineering record? Impeccable. His wartime record? Something else entirely. Rudolph ran operations at Mittelwerk, the underground factory. He oversaw the production floor where Dora prisoners assembled V-2 rockets until they collapsed and died. He signed production reports. He tracked output against quota. He requested replacement laborers when the death rate thinned the workforce. Kurt Debus ran launch operations at Cape Canaveral. He held SS membership and reportedly denounced a colleague to the Gestapo for anti-Nazi remarks. Hubertus Struchold, called the father of space medicine, had links to experiments on Dachau prisoners. These were not minor figures on the margins. They held senior roles at the heart of the American space program. The roster reads like a war crimes investigation waiting to happen. In several cases, decades later, it became exactly that. For 3 decades, none of this mattered publicly. The Cold War served as justification. The moon landing served as vindication. Men who might have faced a war crimes tribunal instead shook hands with presidents on NASA stages. The question nobody wanted to ask was blunt. It hung in the air for decades like smoke. Did the ends justify the means? Or did America simply decide they did and build the story backward? A version of this story frames Operation Paperclip as ugly but necessary. The argument runs like this. The Soviets recruited the same scientists. If America had refused on moral grounds, Stalin would have taken every one of them. Soviet rocket programs did absorb hundreds of German engineers. The nuclear standoff was real. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were not hypothetical. The Cold War posed an existential threat. Letting that strategic talent reach the enemy was not an option. This argument carries weight. The Soviets recruited aggressively. Their operation, sometimes called Osoaviakim, struck in a single October night in 1946. They moved entire families of German scientists to the Soviet Union. No requests, no negotiations. They loaded people onto trains. Against that backdrop, the American program looks almost civilized. Job offers versus forced relocation. That comparison became the entire defense. But the argument hits a wall. The United States did not merely hire these men. It erased their records. It lied to its own State Department. It violated a presidential directive. It did all of this while prosecuting Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. In the same year, in the same country's name. The contradiction went beyond irony. It became policy. It became routine. It became invisible. Some historians point to a middle path. Hire the scientists, use their knowledge, but keep their records intact. Deny them citizenship. Keep them off magazine covers. Never let them become American heroes without acknowledging their German past. That path existed. It was reasonable. Nobody took it, not because it failed, but because it created friction. Friction slowed rockets. Rockets were the priority. For 40 years, Arthur Rudolph lived quietly in San Jose, California. He had retired from NASA in 1969 with the Distinguished Service Medal, the agency's highest honor. He played golf. He tended a garden. He attended reunions. His neighbors knew him as a retired engineer. By every visible measure, he had become a successful American immigrant. His file sat in a government archive, untouched and unread. Then, in 1979, the Office of Special Investigations came knocking. Congress created the OSI specifically to find former Nazis living in the United States. The office inherited decades of institutional neglect. Eli Rosenbaum, a young attorney who would later lead the office, began pulling threads in the paperclip files. Rudolph's case left no room for ambiguity. Production logs from Mittelwerk, requisition orders, personnel requests bearing Rudolph's signature, eyewitness testimony from Dora survivors who named him as the operations director. The evidence had been available for decades. Nobody had opened the drawer. Rudolph had not merely worked near a concentration camp. He had managed its daily output. Think of a factory foreman tracking daily production, except the workers died on schedule. When prisoners collapsed faster than replacements arrived, he requisitioned more. When production quotas slipped, the response never changed: work the laborers harder. Every document sat in American archives the entire time. The filing cabinets were never locked. The answers sat in plain sight. Nobody looked because nobody received orders to look. In 1984, the Justice Department gave Rudolph a choice: face a public denaturalization trial with all its evidence on display, or renounce citizenship voluntarily and leave. He chose to leave. He flew back to Germany. No charges followed him across the Atlantic. No conviction. No prison cell. The man who ran the factory that killed 20,000 people retired to Hamburg. His NASA pension arrived on schedule. Direct deposit. No interruption. Every month, without interruption, until he died. The Rudolph case cracked the silence open. Journalists started asking questions that had gathered dust in filing cabinets for decades. Who else entered through Paperclip? What did their original files say? Who inside the government signed off on the forgeries? Each answer raised a new question. Answers surfaced slowly, through Freedom of Information requests and declassified memos. One journalist spent years assembling the full picture. Her name was Annie Jacobsen. Annie Jacobsen published Operation Paperclip in 2014. The book drew on declassified documents, wartime records, and interviews with the scientists' families. It named names. It matched original files against the JIOA rewrites. It traced each falsified dossier step by step. It revealed cases that had never gone public. Scientists linked to human experiments, chemical weapons research, direct participation in atrocities. Jacobsen's work exposed something larger than a handful of bad decisions. The JIOA had built a system: intake, review, rewrite, resubmit. It functioned like an assembly line for denial. Officers who raised ethical concerns found themselves sidelined. Scientists who should have failed screening received reclassification instead. The paperclip on the folder served as more than a nickname. It described a method. Attach a clean sheet, move the file forward, close the drawer, never look back. Hubertus Struchold, the space medicine pioneer, once had a prestigious award named after him. In 2013, the Space Medicine Association stripped his name from the honor. Decades of evidence linking him to Dachau left no alternative. No formal investigation ever reached completion. Struchold died in 1986, an American citizen in good standing, holding honors nobody had thought to revoke. Kurt Debus, the launch director, retired from NASA in 1974. Kennedy Space Center still carries infrastructure he designed. His original file documented SS membership and Gestapo connections. The JIOA rewrote that file. Nobody investigated him. He died in 1983 in a country that gave him everything and asked nothing about his past. The Osenberg list survived because someone failed to flush a toilet. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal origin of America's most uncomfortable space secret. A clogged drain in a bombed university preserved 15,000 names. Those names reshaped the Cold War. They rewrote immigration law in secret. They put boot prints on the moon. They created a moral debt that remains uncollected. History pivots on small mechanical failures. One clogged pipe, one soggy page. A plumber might have changed everything. The names stay hidden. The rockets stay unbuilt. The moon stays untouched. Unreachable. 20,000 prisoners still die, but for nothing. Von Braun never stood trial. Rudolph never served a sentence. Debus never faced a hearing. Struchold never lost his citizenship. 4 men, 4 clean exits. The system that brought them to America made accountability structurally impossible. Not by accident, by design. Clean files, fresh cover sheets. A country too fixated on tomorrow to audit yesterday. The future always won. It still does. It always will. The forgetting continues. The file stays closed. The myth stays intact. "20,000 people died in tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains. They died so that 3,000 rockets could fly. Decades later, a descendant of that same engineering carried human beings to another world. Both of those facts are true. Neither cancels the other. History does not do arithmetic. It does not subtract horror from achievement and call the remainder clean. The horror and the achievement coexist. They always will. That is not a flaw in the story. That is the whole story. A species reaching for the stars with hands that are not clean. One photograph defines the mythology. Von Braun standing beside the Saturn V, arms crossed, smiling. Florida sun behind him. It is the most reproduced image in NASA's entire archive. Somewhere beneath that rocket's shadow, invisible, uncredited, unnamed, stand the ghosts of Mittelbau-Dora. They built the first version of that machine with bare hands, in darkness, until they could not stand. The photograph never shows them. No monument names them. The shadow stays. The names do not. Nothing ever does. One list, 15,000 names, and a country that chose not to look. If this changed how you see it, subscribe. What part hit you the hardest? This is Curious Minds. See you next time.